Secretary Robert Gates served as Deputy National Security Advisor and CIA Director under President George Herbert Walker Bush. He's worked under 8 presidents in his decades of public service, most recently as Secretary of Defense under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He's here for an interview you'll see first on CBS This Morning. Mr. Secretary, good morning.
Thank you.
So of all those presidents, where does George Herbert Walker Bush slot in?
Well, he clearly was my favorite. I spent the most time with him, during those tumultuous days in 1989 and 1990, 91, with all the history that was being made. His National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and I probably, on average, spent 2 or 3 hours a day with him. And when he traveled domestically, I went with him. I think it was as much because he wanted somebody to talk to about foreign policy as anything else.
We hear a lot about the attribute of restraint with President Bush. How did that play out in terms of national security, specifically with respect to the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, I think the best example, and one where he was criticized, was he was criticized for not celebrating sufficiently when the Berlin Wall came down. And what he understood that very few of his critics understood was that Gorbachev's position in Moscow was relatively parlous at that time. And the concern that he had was that if he celebrated too much, it could serve as a provocation to the conservatives in the Soviet Union, who were still powerful in the KGB, the army, and the party. In fact, the same people who launched a coup against Gorbachev 2 years later. And I think in retrospect, he felt, and we all felt, that had he pushed too hard, had he celebrated too hard that November, it might in fact have precipitated the coup against Gorbachev a couple of years earlier, and he may not have survived it.
And fast forward to today when Vladimir Putin calls the fall of communism the worst devastation that could have happened in the 20th century. Let me ask you about something that I keep hearing and reading from a lot of Democrats, too, who have said they voted for maybe one Republican for president, and that was George H.W. Bush, that in fact he may have been the best president of their lifetime. What do you think it was about him that brought in people from the other side of the aisle?
I think it was his willingness to reach across the aisle. He always put the best interest of the country first. The decision that he made to compromise on no new taxes was really he felt that was really necessary to put the country on a sound fiscal basis going forward, and he was willing to work with the Democrats to do it, knowing full well what the political cost would be. And so his willingness to put a partisan agenda, to make the partisan agenda secondary to what was in the best interest of the country, I think had a lot of appeal to the Democrats on the Hill. I also think just it was his personality, the way he reached out to them. He'd have them down to the White House for a drink in the evening. He cultivated them. He spent time with them. He'd served up there, so he knew their practices. He knew the way it worked on the Hill. So I think it was all those things that made people willing to work with him. That said, there were still some pretty partisan battles during that time, and I remember them.
We keep hearing about his sense of humor and his compassion. You spent every day you spent with him for at least 2 years, so you got to see him publicly and privately. Can you give us an example of his humor and an example of his compassion? He
was just a lot of fun to work for.
Yeah.
So my favorite, he's the only president I ever worked for who actually created an award for the person who most obviously fell asleep in a meeting with the President of the United States. And this wasn't frivolous.
Yeah.
He evaluated you in terms of the depth of your sleep. Snoring
good.
Always got you points.
That's good.
The duration, and then the quality of the recovery. Did you just kind of return to consciousness, or with a jolt did you knock the coffee over?
That's good. And his
compassion, I remember vividly. I flew down on the helicopter with him to Norfolk after the tragedy on the battleship Iowa, in which a turret blew up and killed 43 sailors. And he went down to the memorial service. And on the helicopter, he kept reading his remarks, and he kept breaking down. And he said, I don't know if I can get through this. He said, I once asked Ronald Reagan, how do you get through these things? And Reagan said, well, I just go over it over and over and over it. And Bush said, I just keep going over and over and over it. And I just can't get past this one passage. So he gave the remarks, and as is typical, he got criticized because he rushed through his remarks. And there were only a handful of us that realized he rushed through his remarks because he knew that was the only way he would make it without breaking down in front of a national television audience. He felt very deeply. We talked about his sense of humor. That sense of humor sort of went underground for the entire period of the Gulf War. He knew the responsibility he was taking on. He knew that he was sending hundreds of thousands of young Americans into peril, into harm's way. And a lot of the joking around went away, frankly, until after the war was over.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being with us.
Absolutely.